Every country on Earth is in debt. The United States, China, Japan, even Switzerland. But if everyone owes money, who are they all borrowing from? It sounds like a simple question, but behind it lies the most complex financial mystery in modern history. Because if the entire planet is in debt, $300 trillion and counting, then someone somewhere must be the creditor. And yet no one can point to a single person, country, or institution and say, they're the ones owed all the money. So where is this money hiding? And how did we build a world economy that owes more than it produces? To understand that, we need to strip debt down to its core. Because debt isn't just numbers on a government spreadsheet. It's the very foundation of how modern civilization functions. Every bridge, hospital, factory, and startup began with the same concept: borrowing from tomorrow to build today. Debt isn't inherently evil. It's a promise, a trade between trust and time. But what happens when every promise depends on another? When every dollar in circulation is someone else's IOU? That's when debt stops being a tool and becomes the system itself. Let's go back to where this all began. Long before central banks, before Wall Street, before trillion-dollar budgets, debt was personal villages traded on memory and reputation. You helped your neighbor plant crops. They repaid you after harvest. Trust was the only collateral. But as societies grew, memory wasn't enough. Promises had to be written, quantified, and transferable. That's when the first recorded debts appeared. Clay tablets from ancient Mesopotamia, 5,000 years ago, documenting who owed what to whom. From that moment forward, debt became civilization's hidden engine. It financed kingdoms, funded wars, and built empires. But it also enslaved millions, binding entire populations not with chains, but with obligations. Fast forward to the 17th century, London, 1694. The English crown was broke. Wars with France had drained the treasury, and the king couldn't pay his soldiers. So he struck a deal with merchants: lend the crown money, and in return, you'll receive interest backed by taxes. That deal created the Bank of England, the world's first central bank, and changed history forever. For the first time, a government could borrow from its own citizens through bonds, promises of future payment. Those who held them became investors, not servants. The people who lent became the first invisible creditors of a nation. Soon, other countries followed. France, the Netherlands, America. All discovered the same secret. With enough trust, a nation could borrow infinite amounts. All it needed was confidence that it would eventually pay it back. But that confidence is fragile. It depends not on gold or silver, but on belief that tomorrow will always be better than today. By the 20th century, debt had evolved into something unrecognizable. World wars demanded massive borrowing. Nations issued bonds to fund the front lines, industries, and reconstruction. By 1945, the global debt web had grown so vast that even peace depended on it. So, world leaders gathered at Bretton Woods to rebuild the system. They created the IMF, the World Bank, and tied every currency to the US dollar, which in turn was tied to gold. For a time, it worked. Every dollar represented real value. Every debt had a limit. But there was a problem. Gold was finite. Growth was not. As economies expanded, there wasn't enough gold to back the ever-growing number of dollars governments wanted to spend more, invest more, promise more, and gold couldn't keep up. Then came 1971. President Richard Nixon severed the dollar's link to gold. From that moment, money no longer represented something physical. It represented confidence. Fiat money, money by decree, was born. And with that, the floodgates opened. Governments could now print, borrow, and spend without restraint. Debt became infinite because money itself became debt. Every dollar, euro, and yen is a claim on future labor, a promise of future value that doesn't yet exist. That's why the question, who do we owe, is so hard to answer. Because we owe it to each other, through a network so vast, so circular, that no one stands outside of it. The US owes money to Japan. Japan owes money to China. China owes money to its banks, which hold US Treasury bonds. And those banks are partly funded by global investors, pension funds, insurance companies, and even individuals from the US itself. In other words, we've created a debt Ouroboros, a snake eating its own tail, a system where the creditor and the debtor are one and the same. So what happens if it ever stops? If one country says, enough, we won't borrow anymore. The entire machine would seize. Growth would halt. Jobs would vanish. Banks would freeze. Because debt isn't just part of the economy, it is the economy. That's the paradox of modern finance. The world owes $300 trillion, but if everyone paid it back, money itself would disappear. But here's where the mystery deepens. If debt is owed within the system, who controls the system? Who ensures that this invisible balance of promises doesn't collapse? That's where we'll go next, into the hidden architecture of global finance. The network of institutions, algorithms, and silent agreements that hold together a world where everyone owes and no one owns. Because behind every dollar of debt lies a shadow, the unseen creditor that doesn't have a face, a name, or a nationality. And it might just be the most powerful entity humanity has ever created. So who exactly is this mysterious creditor? If nations, corporations, and citizens all owe money, where does the line of ownership end? To find that answer, we have to look at the institutions that sit quietly between governments and markets, the central banks. Central banks are the architects of modern debt. They don't just control interest rates, they control the heartbeat of the global economy. When a government spends more than it earns, which is almost always, it issues bonds. Those bonds are bought by banks, funds, and investors. But when the appetite for those bonds weakens, the central bank steps in and buys them itself. In other words, the government borrows from its own moneymaker. The left hand owes the right hand, and the cycle continues. The United States borrows in dollars, which the Federal Reserve can create out of thin air. Japan borrows in yen, backed by the Bank of Japan. Europe borrows in euros, supported by the European Central Bank. These institutions don't operate like normal creditors. They don't seek profit, they seek stability. Their mission is to make sure the system never stops. But that's the paradox. In preventing collapse, they've made collapse unthinkable, and therefore inevitable. Every time there's a financial crisis, 2008, 2020, 2023, the same pattern repeats: debt surges. Central banks cut rates, print money, and absorb bad assets. They are the last buyer standing, the lender of last resort. And every rescue plants the seeds for the next crisis, because easy money breeds more debt. So if central banks are creating money to buy government debt, are they the mysterious creditor? Not exactly. Because even central banks have masters, not kings or politicians, but confidence itself. The moment the public loses faith in their ability to maintain value, the illusion shatters. And we've seen glimpses of that in hyperinflationary episodes, in currency collapses, in the quiet panic of investors fleeing to gold and digital assets. Confidence, not currency, is the true collateral of our time. But let's go deeper. Central banks are only part of the equation. Behind them stands a far more elusive entity, a network known as the shadow banking system. The shadow banking system isn't illegal, it's simply invisible. It's made up of hedge funds, insurance companies, money market funds, and corporate lenders who operate outside traditional regulations. They lend trillions every day, creating credit instruments that look nothing like conventional loans, repurchase agreements, derivatives, asset swaps, but all serve the same purpose: generating debt from debt. These shadow institutions don't create money directly, but they multiply it through leverage. A single dollar borrowed can become $10 lent. And because these transactions are layered, complex, and often off-balance sheet, even governments struggle to track them. The result? A global economy built on a foundation no one fully understands. Debt that feeds on itself. Creditors that are also debtors. And risk that hides in plain sight. In 2008, that hidden structure cracked. Mortgage-backed securities, loans bundled, sold, and resold, collapsed under their own weight. The entire world discovered what happens when invisible creditors lose confidence. Markets froze. Banks imploded. And governments had to step in, not to punish, but to preserve. The lesson was brutal but clear. The modern financial system isn't built to eliminate debt, it's built to perpetuate it. Because here's the truth. Debt isn't just an economic tool. It's a control mechanism. It keeps nations interdependent, economies synchronized, and citizens compliant. It ensures that everyone, from the richest state to the smallest household, remains tied to the same invisible clock, the next payment due. Think about it. Every paycheck, every tax, every budget negotiation, all orbit the same gravitational center, servicing debt. Interest never sleeps. It doesn't care who's in power, what laws are passed, or who wins the next election. It demands repayment. Always. So maybe the mysterious creditor isn't a person or even an institution. Maybe it's the system itself. A self-sustaining organism whose survival depends on constant borrowing. And yet, this system isn't immortal. It relies on growth, endless exponential growth. But how can anything grow forever on a finite planet? That's the question the 21st century can no longer avoid. Global debt now exceeds 350% of total world GDP. That means humanity owes 3.5 times more than it produces in a year. The only way to sustain it is to keep expanding through technology, consumption, and speculation. But each expansion comes at a cost: rising inequality, currency debasement, environmental strain. The more we borrow from the future, the less future remains to borrow from still. Governments continue to promise, print, and postpone, because the alternative, deflation, is political suicide. A slowing economy means unemployment, unrest, and lost elections. And so, we choose the lesser poison: inflation. Inflation is the quiet tax that keeps the illusion alive. It erodes the real value of debt without ever declaring default. Your savings shrink, your wages lag, your cost of living rises, and the system resets itself without anyone pulling the alarm. That's how the mysterious creditor collects payment, silently, invisibly through time itself. When a loaf of bread that once cost $1 now costs $2, you've paid part of the global debt, not with cash, but with purchasing power. The system takes value not by seizing assets, but by diluting them. So, if the world owes money to itself, and central banks control the printing presses, and inflation silently repays the unrepayable, then what, exactly, is real wealth? Because if everything is debt, then ownership is just another illusion. That question, what is real value in a world built on promises, leads us to the next layer of the mystery. A world where financial power no longer resides in nations, but in networks. And the people who control those networks may not sit in parliaments or palaces. They sit behind screens, algorithms, and institutions so vast that even governments depend on them. In Part 3, we'll pull back the curtain on those networks, the top holders of global debt, the asset managers, and the digital systems shaping who wins and who loses in this infinite game of IOUs. Because if debt is the language of modern power, someone still writes the grammar. If debt is the bloodstream of the modern world, then someone, or something, must be controlling the flow. But who? If governments borrow, if central banks print, and if citizens work to repay, then who holds the ledger that ties all of it together? The answer begins with a name you've probably heard: BlackRock. Not a government, not a bank, but the largest asset manager on Earth. Over $10 trillion under management, a sum larger than the GDP of Japan and Germany combined. Yet, here's the strange part. BlackRock doesn't own that money. It controls it. Pension funds, insurance pools, sovereign wealth funds, they all deposit capital into asset managers. BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, Fidelity. These are the quiet giants that decide where trillions flow every single day. They buy government bonds, corporate stocks, and real estate. They are the bridge between savers and states, between citizens and the global machine. And in that bridge lies power greater than any single government. Because while politicians argue about spending, these institutions decide who gets funded. They are the anonymous creditors behind your national debt, your mortgage, your city's infrastructure. When you hear that your country owes trillions, much of that money is parked inside index funds, mutual funds, and global portfolios run by these firms. In other words, the mysterious creditor isn't a face. It's an algorithm. BlackRock's Aladdin system, a supercomputer that tracks and analyses global financial data, makes more decisions every second than a human could in a lifetime. It knows where every dollar sits, which markets are rising, which bonds are falling, and how to balance risk across continents. Governments rely on it, banks rely on it, even central banks rely on it. And yet, almost no one outside the system understands how it truly works. If the world's debt is a web, Aladdin is the spider. But this isn't a conspiracy. It's a design born from efficiency. The global financial system has simply become too complex for humans to manage directly, so we built algorithms to handle it for us. And now those algorithms are shaping the destiny of nations. When a country issues new debt, these systems decide whether it's a good risk. They decide the interest rate, the demand, and even how much of that debt will be bought automatically. A small change in an algorithmic preference can move billions, even trillions, across borders in minutes. No voting, no speeches, no approval needed. So ask yourself, if debt determines power and algorithms determine debt, who really governs the global economy? Because maybe the mysterious creditor isn't a person, or even an organization. Maybe it's the system of systems we've built, a digital labyrinth of self-reinforcing code, where human intent has become secondary to mathematical logic. But before we go full digital, let's take a step back and ask something simpler. Why do countries borrow in the first place? If they can print their own currency, why not just create what they need? The answer is credibility. You see, printing money is easy. Maintaining trust in that money is not. When a government prints recklessly, inflation eats its value, investors flee. And suddenly, nobody wants that currency. Debt, however, creates accountability. When a country issues a bond, it's making a promise. We will repay this with interest. That promise is what investors trust. Debt, paradoxically, creates stability, but only as long as everyone believes repayment is possible. When that belief fades, the system trembles. That's why even the richest nations, the US, Japan, Germany, still issue debt. They could print, but they choose to borrow, because borrowing keeps the illusion of responsibility alive, and in that illusion lies power. Debt makes nations predictable. It ties their fate to the market. It forces them to maintain good relations with the very institutions that hold their bonds. If you ever wonder why countries avoid drastic reform, or why politicians tiptoe around big financial interests, that's why. They don't want to anger their creditors, because the modern creditor isn't a king with an army. It's a spreadsheet with $1 trillion balance. Now let's go even deeper. into the sovereign layer of this global network. Sitting above asset managers are the sovereign wealth funds, national treasuries that invest on behalf of entire countries. Norway's oil fund, China's CIC, the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, Saudi Arabia's PIF. Together, they hold over $12 trillion in assets. They lend to corporations, to other governments, and even to the countries that borrow from them through global bonds. Yes, some of America's debt is owned by China's sovereign fund, and some of China's debt is owned by American investors. Debt isn't a chain anymore. It's a circle. So who's the mysterious creditor? It's all of them, and none of them. Because in this circle, every creditor is also a debtor. China lends to the U.S. through treasury bonds. The U.S. lends to China through corporate investment. Europe lends to Asia. Asia lends to Africa. Africa lends to Europe through raw materials and future contracts. Money moves, debt grows, and the system balances, for now. But balance doesn't mean safety, it means dependence. If one node fails, if one major economy defaults or destabilizes, the shock ripples across the web instantly. And because so much of that web is automated, there's no switch to stop it. The 2008 crisis was triggered by subprime mortgages worth less than $1 trillion. Imagine what would happen if a sovereign bond market, say Japan or Italy, were to collapse. We're talking tens of trillions evaporating overnight. That's not a prediction. It's a probability. And probabilities in finance don't have morals. Now here's the eerie part. Every crisis, no matter how destructive, strengthens the system in the long run. How? Because it consolidates control. After 2008, small banks failed, big ones got bigger. After 2020, small businesses closed, corporate giants expanded. After every storm, fewer players control more of the global game. Debt doesn't just create dependency, it centralizes power. And maybe that's the point. Because when everything is owed to someone, and that someone is a shrinking circle of institutions, the world becomes easier to manage. Easier for whom? That's the question. Every note, every coin, every number on your banking app, they all claim to represent value. But what is value, really? A promise? A belief? Or a story we've all agreed to tell ourselves? To understand how the world ended up $300 trillion in debt, we have to look at the moment value became separated from reality. Centuries ago, money was physical: gold, silver, metal stamped with royal seals. You couldn't create more of it by decree. It was scarce, tangible, and mined from the earth. That scarcity gave it credibility. People trusted it because no one could simply invent it. Then came the paper promise. Banknotes, backed by precious metals. A dollar represented a fixed amount of gold. A promise you could redeem at any time. It worked because that promise was believable. But belief is fragile. When the 20th century exploded with war, nations realized they could fight longer and rebuild faster by breaking that link. They needed flexibility, and gold was a chain, so one by one, they severed it. The United States made the final cut in 1971. Money was no longer a representation of gold. It was a declaration of faith. From that moment, the dollar wasn't just currency. It was confidence incarnate. And confidence, as we've seen, can be manufactured with the right story. Trust us, governments said. We'll manage it. And for decades they did, more or less. But once money lost its physical anchor, something changed deep in the structure of the world economy. Money became infinite. And when something becomes infinite, its meaning begins to fade. Debt exploded because suddenly, there was no natural limit, no weight, no constraint. The only boundary left was how much confidence the world was willing to maintain. At first, it felt like liberation. Economies grew, credit expanded, people lived better, bought more, built more. But behind every skyscraper, every smartphone, every policy promise. There was a shadow ledger quietly growing, and that ledger is now larger than the sum of all real things. The entire planet's wealth, every building, every machine, every line of code, totals about $100 trillion. But the total debt? More than triple that. So how can something be owed that doesn't even exist? Because modern debt doesn't require reality. It only requires belief in the future. Every bond is a bet that tomorrow will be richer than today, that will grow enough to pay interest on what we borrowed yesterday. And for decades, that story worked. But now, cracks are showing. Growth is slowing. Populations are aging. Resources are tightening. Yet the machine still demands expansion. We've created a system where debt must rise forever, or everything stops. The system doesn't care if that growth comes from innovation, exploitation, or illusion. It only cares that the numbers keep increasing. That's why when the real economy slows, the financial economy speeds up. Speculation replaces production. Trading replaces building. Wealth becomes virtual, existing not in goods or services, but in digits on screens. And those digits are backed not by gold, not by work, not even by time, but by trust. So when you ask who the mysterious creditor is, maybe it's not a who at all. Maybe it's the future itself. We're not borrowing from other people. We're borrowing from tomorrow, from generations that haven't even been born. Every deficit, every promise, every printed dollar is a claim on future labor, future resources, future stability. We're spending what doesn't yet exist, hoping it will appear in time to settle the books. But what happens when the future runs out of collateral? You can already feel the tremors. Housing prices that outpace wages. Education that costs decades of debt. Healthcare that turns illness into bankruptcy. In every corner of society, the same story repeats. The cost of today mortgaged against the hope of tomorrow. And maybe that's the real secret. The mysterious creditor isn't hidden behind a vault or a corporate logo. It's the unborn future itself. We owe the world that doesn't yet exist, and that debt can't be paid in dollars or yen. It can only be paid in consequences. When a forest is cut for profit, that's future debt. When oceans are poisoned for cheap goods, that's future debt. When inflation quietly eats your savings, that's the system collecting its payment, not in cash, but in time, stability, and trust debt. Once a tool of cooperation, has become humanity's operating system. It defines what's possible, what's profitable, even what's moral. If something can't be monetized, it's ignored. If something can't produce return, it's forgotten. And yet the irony is breathtaking, because all of this began with a simple human idea. Trust a promise to repay, a belief in tomorrow. Debt didn't start as greed. It started as cooperation, a bridge between need and abundance. But over time, that bridge became a cage. Now every country, company, and citizen is trapped inside a machine that only knows one direction: forward. To slow down is collapse. To stop is extinction. So we run faster, we borrow more, we build higher, and we call it progress. But deep down, the world feels it. That subtle unease, that quiet knowledge that something isn't sustainable, that we're not just living on borrowed money, but on borrowed time. The question isn't whether debt will end, it's how. Will it unravel in a crisis, or will we learn to redefine value before it's too late? Because if we continue believing that value equals debt, then when the system resets, as all systems eventually do, everything tied to it resets too. Money, politics, power, trust. The mysterious creditor will call in its loan, and there won't be anyone left to pay. In Part 5, we'll explore how that reset might unfold, the scenarios economists fear, the digital alternatives rising to replace the old order, and what a world without debt might actually look like. Imagine a day when the numbers stop moving. When screens freeze, banks pause, and governments fall silent. It wouldn't begin with explosions or protests. It would start with hesitation. A single question whispered across trading floors and ministries. What if they can't pay? Confidence, the invisible glue of the global economy, doesn't shatter loudly. It erodes, and when it finally breaks, it's already too late. That's the true danger of a world built on debt. Its collapse doesn't happen at the edges. It happens at the center, where trust evaporates first. The first signs are subtle. Bond yields spike, currencies wobble, headlines fill with words like liquidity crisis. Investors pull back, credit tightens, and the world begins to shrink. Debt isn't just a number. It's circulation, blood moving through the veins of civilization. When the flow slows, everything weakens. Governments cut spending, companies lay off workers, consumers stop buying. And just like that, the machine that once grew endlessly begins to suffocate on its own momentum. The reset would not happen everywhere at once. It would ripple. It might start in a developing economy already cornered by rising interest rates, a nation that suddenly can't afford to roll over its debt. Default spreads like contagion. Investors flee to safety, usually the dollar, the world's reserve currency. But this time, safety itself is compromised. Because the United States, once the anchor of stability, now carries more debt than any empire in history. At $36 trillion and counting, its liabilities exceed its GDP, its assets, even the combined wealth of its citizens if counted by liquidity. And yet, the entire planet still depends on those debts being honored. So when trust falters, the paradox unfolds. The debtor is too big to fail, but too indebted to save. Central banks would respond the way they always have, printing money, slashing rates, promising stimulus. But what happens when the medicine becomes the poison? Every dollar printed to buy time devalues the dollars already in existence. Inflation turns into hyperinflation. Faith dissolves into panic. People rush to anything real: food, fuel, land, gold, crypto, even water rights. In the silence between markets, a strange clarity would emerge. The realization that the entire system was never about wealth. It was about belief. The fall of global debt would not be a singular event. It would be a process, a slow death of complexity. Governments would nationalize banks to keep the lights on. Digital currencies would surge as traditional finance chokes on its own paperwork. The IMF and World Bank would attempt to restructure trillions overnight, rewriting contracts that can't possibly be honored. At the same time, nations would turn inward. Supply chains fracture. Trade agreements dissolve. A new kind of economic nationalism rises. Not out of ideology, but necessity. You can already see the outlines: energy independence movements, local production, strategic reserves, a quiet preparation for the moment when globalization, fueled by endless borrowing, finally breaks its circuit. And somewhere amid this chaos, a new idea begins to take shape. When trust in paper fails, humans don't stop trading, they reinvent the medium. Just as gold replaced barter and paper replaced gold, the next evolution is already waiting: the digital ledger. Unlike traditional banking, where debt is opaque and centralized, the ledger is transparent and distributed. Every transaction recorded, every promise visible, every imbalance traceable. For years, cryptocurrencies have been dismissed as volatile toys, speculative assets without anchors. But in the ashes of fiat collapse, that volatility might become freedom. A decentralized currency doesn't need faith in governments, only in mathematics. It doesn't rely on trust. It enforces it through code. In such a world, nations might lose monopoly over money itself, and power would shift from states to systems. But here lies another paradox. Even digital money cannot escape debt. Because as long as humans desire more than they have, they will borrow from the future. Debt will simply take a new form, coded, measured, maybe even tokenized, but never truly gone. The reset, then, isn't an end, it's a transformation. A chance to rebuild the meaning of value itself. Behind every trillion-dollar collapse, there are people, not numbers. The family that loses savings in a currency collapse. The factory worker whose job disappears when credit dries up. The retiree whose pension evaporates because bonds failed. Debt, for all its abstraction, is deeply human. It measures not just our consumption, but our expectations. Our faith that tomorrow will be kinder than today. When that faith breaks, the real cost isn't financial, it's psychological. Societies built on growth don't know how to stand still. When the future stops expanding, the present feels unbearable. And that's the moment when every civilization faces its reflection, stripped of illusions, confronted with the raw truth of what it has built. The mysterious creditor we've been searching for, the one behind all debts, reveals itself in the mirror. It was never China, never Wall Street, never the IMF. It was us. Every saver, every consumer, every voter demanding more comfort, more convenience, more growth, without asking who would pay for it. Debt is simply the collective shadow of human desire, a reflection of everything we want faster than we're willing to earn. And maybe that's why the system feels impossible to escape, because it's built from our own choices. The reset, when it comes, will not just destroy economies. It will challenge identities. It will ask us, what is wealth if not debt disguised as hope? What is money if not memory, a record of promises never fully kept? And when the world stops pretending, maybe that's the moment we begin to build something real again. In the silence after collapse, new rules emerge. Communities relearn cooperation without credit. Nations rediscover value in tangible things: energy, food, knowledge, and time. Trade resumes, but smaller, more local. Economies stabilize not through borrowing, but through balance. Perhaps in that quieter world, money returns to what it was meant to be: a tool, not a tether. A medium of exchange, not an altar of worship. The mystery of global debt ends not with an answer, but with an understanding. The creditor we feared was never hiding. It was always the sum of our collective expectations. And if we choose differently, if we choose sustainability over speed, cooperation over consumption, then maybe, for the first time in centuries, humanity can live without owing the future to survive the present. The world didn't end. It just stopped pretending. The numbers that once ruled everything, GDP, deficits, interest rates, no longer carried authority. They became relics, like fossils of an extinct species, that once defined the ecosystem of human progress. When the debt machine finally collapsed, the silence that followed wasn't chaos. It was recalibration. For the first time in centuries, humanity stood face to face with a question we had forgotten how to ask. What is value, really? For generations, we measured power through credit. Nations were great if they could borrow more. Corporations were strong if they could expand faster. People were successful if they could spend freely. But when the music stopped and the credit lines went dark, the rhythm of civilization changed. It slowed. And in that stillness, a new economy began to breathe. The first currencies to emerge weren't printed. They were produced. Energy became the new gold. Kilowatt hours, not dollars, determined status. Communities traded electricity the way nations once traded oil. In places where the sun shone longer or the wind blew stronger, small towns became power hubs, exporting energy credits to neighbors, no longer tied to distant banks or central authorities. Water, too, became wealth. In arid regions, reservoirs were treated like national treasuries, each drop measured, exchanged, conserved. And food, once a commodity, became sacred. A hectare of fertile land now carried more security than a vault full of bonds. The irony was bitter. After centuries of abstraction, humanity had returned to tangible value. What you could grow, store, or generate became your true worth. It wasn't a regression. It was evolution, a forced awakening. But not everything went back to the past. Technology didn't die with the old system. It adapted. Artificial intelligence became the new accountant of civilization. Instead of managing debt, it managed resources, tracking supply, predicting demand, redistributing excess. Digital ledgers, once used to record loans, now mapped the flow of energy, food, and goods in real time. Every person, every machine, every community contributed to a vast decentralized network, a living organism of balance rather than exploitation. For the first time, global coordination didn't depend on trust in governments or corporations. It was mathematical, transparent. Immutable people didn't owe each other. They shared within programmable systems of exchange, verified by algorithms instead of middlemen. The credit score was replaced by something far older and far simpler. Reputation. Not your wealth, but your reliability. Not your balance, but your behavior. And in this new economy, the question of debt became almost philosophical. How do you owe in a world that measures everything in real time? How do you borrow from a future that's already visible through data? When nations lost control of money, individuals found control over themselves. It began quietly. Freelancers trading skills peer-to-peer, families forming microeconomies, collectives building local networks of energy and labor. Borders became less relevant. A programmer in Kenya could earn digital credits verified in Norway. A farmer in Brazil could sell carbon offsets to a family in Seoul. The economy no longer had a center. It had nodes. Power diffused outward, away from governments and toward people. It was the inverse of everything the 20th century had built. Decentralization wasn't ideology anymore. It was survival. But with freedom came responsibility. Without central banks to cushion collapse, individuals had to become their own regulators. Every decision mattered. Every trade carried risk. Every transaction had consequence. And slowly, humanity began to relearn accountability, not enforced by law, but by necessity. The institutions that once defined the world, the IMF, the World Bank, even the Federal Reserve, became hollow symbols. They still existed, but their influence faded as nations turned to local systems. Even China's centralized control began to fragment under pressure from digital alternatives that citizens could trust more than the state. The US dollar, once the backbone of the global economy, became a historical reference point, like the Roman denarius or the British pound of empire days. Its final chapter wasn't destruction, but irrelevance. What truly replaced it wasn't another currency. It was an idea. A universal exchange language, built on digital consensus, immune to manipulation but not to morality. Human beings had finally created a monetary system that reflected their collective behavior rather than their political ambition, and that made it both beautiful and fragile. When debt disappeared, so did infinite growth. And without infinite growth, the world had to redefine prosperity. The new metric wasn't expansion, but equilibrium. The goal of nations was no longer more, but enough. A family's success wasn't measured in income, but in resilience, their ability to withstand change without collapse. A company's reputation wasn't tied to quarterly profit, but to its contribution to local stability. Even technology shifted focus from acceleration to efficiency. For the first time, humanity's economic model aligned with nature's own. Growth within limits, adaptation without excess. It was humbling and liberating. People worked fewer hours, produced less waste, consumed more consciously. Cities shrank to manageable sizes, trade routes simplified. And art, the one currency that couldn't be replicated or digitized, flourished again. Without the constant pressure of profit, creativity returned to its true form, expression without obligation. But even in this new world, the memory of debt lingered like a scar. Every generation that had lived through collapse carried an unspoken lesson. Never again. Never again would we borrow from the future to buy illusions in the present. Never again would trust be outsourced to systems that forgot the value of human integrity. Children learned history differently, not as wars or inventions, but as cycles of imbalance and correction. Every empire that rose on credit had eventually fallen to the same truth. You cannot compound what isn't real. And yet deep down, a quiet fear remained. Because the seed of debt isn't in money, it's in human nature. As long as we dream beyond our means, as long as we reach for tomorrow before earning today, debt will always return, not as economics, but as desire. That's the final paradox. We can erase numbers, but not ambition. We can reset systems, but not the longing that built them. So if every country is in debt, and every system eventually resets, who is the mysterious creditor that always gets paid? It's not a government, not a bank, not an invisible elite. It's time. Time collects what money can't. It takes interest in the form of generations. It erases false wealth, rewards patience, and punishes greed. Every unpaid debt, financial or moral, is eventually settled by time. And maybe that's the answer we've been circling around all along. There is no mystery creditor pulling the strings. There's only a universe balancing its own books, cycle after cycle, century after century. Debt is not evil. It's a teacher. And the final lesson it gives humanity is the simplest of all. You cannot borrow forever. Eventually everything, every empire, every currency, every illusion of control, must be repaid. What if debt isn't just a financial system, but a reflection of the human mind? What if the balance sheets of nations are just mirrors, showing us something we've always refused to see within ourselves? Because before debt ever existed on paper, it existed in emotion and promises, in gratitude, in guilt. Every human relationship, from love to trade, is shaped by an invisible ledger, a sense of owing something to parents, to partners, to society, to time itself. We are born in debt to the people who raised us, the systems that protect us, the planet that feeds us, and from the moment we can speak, we start trying to repay it, even when we don't fully understand how. Long before banks, before coins, before economics had a name, there was only one currency: trust. A hunter shares his catch with the tribe. A farmer lends seed to a neighbor. A mother sacrifices sleep for her child. No contracts, no signatures, just silent accounting. Because every act of giving creates an expectation, the hope that one day the balance will return. That expectation, that unspoken "I owe you," is the birthplace of debt. Not in greed, but in cooperation. Debt, at its origin, was a moral glue. Proof that people were bound to one another through responsibility. Anthropologists like David Graeber called this the moral economy. Money didn't replace morality, it mechanized it. It turned the invisible emotional debts between people into quantifiable units. So you didn't owe a favor, you owed a sum. And that changed everything. But as societies grew, so did desire. Debt evolved from being a symbol of cooperation into a tool of ambition. People didn't just borrow to survive, they borrowed to become, to own, to rise, to live a better version of themselves, even if they couldn't yet afford it. And that's where the trap began. Because psychologically, debt isn't about money, it's about time. When you borrow, you're stealing from your future self. You're saying, tomorrow I'll be better, smarter, richer, stronger, I'll pay it back. But tomorrow rarely arrives the way we imagine it, and so the future self, once free, becomes a debtor, chained to the promises made by the past. That's why debt is emotional. It's not just numbers, it's hope, it's fear, it's identity, We borrow not because we're poor, but because we believe we'll be more. Debt triggers the same circuits in the brain as risk and reward. Neuroscientists have shown that when people take on credit, whether buying a car or swiping a card, the pleasure centers of the brain light up exactly like gambling. It's anticipation, not possession, that fuels consumption. The promise of one day becomes intoxicating, and like any addiction, it escalates. You need more to feel the same thrill, more credit, more luxury, more illusion. Soon the line between need and desire vanishes, and the system, both personal and national, starts to feed on itself. That's why consumer economies are designed around deferred pain. The buy now, pay later model doesn't just make money, it hacks human psychology. It keeps societies forever reaching, forever chasing, forever owing. We don't live in an economy of money. We live in an economy of hope, financed by debt. Think about it. Every commercial you see, every slogan you hear, is built on the same psychological premise. You are not enough, yet. Debt steps in to fill that gap. It promises transformation. The new phone, the bigger house, the faster car, the better life. But beneath the surface, it's not really about things. It's about validation. Debt buys belonging. It allows you to signal status you haven't yet earned, to wear success before you've achieved it. And society rewards that illusion, until it doesn't. Because the emotional economy runs on comparison. Every person measuring themselves against everyone else, and borrowing whatever it takes to stay in the race. This is why debt isn't a bug in the system. It is the system. An endless loop of desire, consumption, and guilt, disguised as progress. Psychologically, debt carries something deeper than numbers. It carries shame. Owing money is never just a financial burden. It's a moral one. It whispers, you failed. You lived beyond your means. You took more than you earned. And if we choose differently, if we choose sustainability over speed, cooperation over consumption, then maybe, for the first time in centuries, humanity can live without owing the future to survive the present. That's why debt collectors are so powerful. Not because of the money, but because of the guilt. They hold a mirror to your ambitions and remind you of where they collapsed. This emotional power has been weaponized for centuries. From feudal landlords to modern banks, the ability to make people feel indebted is the foundation of control. Because people in debt are predictable. They work harder, comply easier, and question less. Debt doesn't just enslave wallets, it enslaves willpower. Here's the hardest truth. In modern society, debt has become part of who we are. You're not just John or Maria or Ahmed. You're a credit profile, a risk score, a series of predictive data points designed to measure your worth. Banks don't see people, they see probabilities. Governments don't see citizens, they see taxpayers. Corporations don't see workers, they see revenue streams. And over time, we start to see ourselves the same way. We become living balance sheets, always calculating, how much am I worth? What can I afford to be? We internalize debt as a measure of morality, confusing financial health with personal virtue. A person with debt feels less worthy, even if they've done nothing wrong. It's a quiet, invisible humiliation, one that billions carry without ever speaking of it. Fear keeps the system alive. Fear of losing credit, fear of missing payments, fear of starting over. That fear drives productivity, but it also kills creativity. How many dreams have been delayed because someone had to play it safe? How many inventions never happened because the inventors were too deep in loans to take a risk? Debt doesn't just control economies, it shapes imaginations. We stop asking, what could I do, and start asking, what can I afford? That is the most subtle form of slavery ever invented. One that replaces chains with contracts, guards with interest rates. And yet, There's a strange peace in understanding this. Once you see debt for what it is, a story, a construct, a shared hallucination, it begins to lose power because the system only works as long as we believe in it, as long as we equate debt with morality and credit with worth. But the moment we stop measuring our value by our balance, the moment we detach identity from interest, the illusion cracks. Liberation doesn't come from paying every cent. It comes from realizing that you were never the debtor. You were the creator of value all along. When enough people understand that, the system changes, not through revolution, but through awakening. Because the greatest creditor of all isn't a bank, it's belief. And belief, unlike money, can vanish in an instant. We have searched for the mysterious creditor in central banks, in asset managers, and even in the future itself. We have traced its origins to the earliest forms of human trust and watched it mutate into a digital, self-sustaining system. But the final revelation is this: the creditor is the architecture itself. The global debt of $300 trillion is not a pile of unpaid bills. It is a design, a complex, invisible hierarchy that binds every government, corporation, and citizen into one single organism. And its survival depends entirely on the illusion of continuous motion. To understand this final layer, we must look at the three interlocking domains of modern debt: the sovereign layer, the architecture of necessity. At the top sites the sovereign layer, the governments, the central banks, and the global institutions, IMF, BIS. Their debt is the foundation of the system. Why? Because government bonds are considered the safest collateral on earth. The U.S. Treasury bond is not just debt. It is the world's ultimate unit of trust. When you hear that the U.S. is $36 trillion in debt, what you're really hearing is that the world has $36 trillion in trust invested in the stability of the American system. This trust is the engine that allows banks to lend, companies to invest, and currencies to circulate. But this layer is also where the trap is set. Because the moment a country issues debt, it sacrifices its own sovereignty to the global financial machine. If a government tries to pursue radical independent economic policy, its bond yields spike. If a government defaults, it is instantly cut off from the global system, facing economic paralysis and political isolation. The hidden architecture uses interest rates as its enforcement mechanism. The freedom of a nation is inversely proportional to the cost of its borrowing. Debt ensures that even the most powerful nations remain predictable, compliant, and ultimately accountable to the market. The corporate layer, the architecture of consolidation. Beneath the sovereign layer lies the corporate hierarchy, the megabanks, the shadow lenders, and the technology giants. These entities exploit the stability created by government debt to execute rapid consolidation. When central banks provide easy money, it doesn't flow to small businesses. It flows to the already established giants. Why? Because they have the scale, the collateral, and the political access to absorb it. They borrow at low rates using sovereign bonds as collateral. They use that cheap credit to buy up competitors, automate industries, and expand across borders. They issue their own corporate debt, turning a promise into capital that fuels exponential growth. This process has created the modern reality, a shrinking number of powerful corporations controlling a rising share of global wealth. Their growth is financed by debt, and their power is secured by the central banks that are committed to stabilizing the system they dominate. The corporate layer is the central processing unit of the debt machine. It turns the government's promise of stability into tangible wealth for the few. The individual layer, the architecture of compliance. At the bottom of the pyramid are the individuals, consumers, households, and small enterprises. Their debt is the mechanism of social control. For the average citizen, debt is not a tool for growth. It is often a prerequisite for participation. Mortgages, Student loans, car payments. These are not choices. They are the price of entry into the middle class. This debt forces compliance, tying citizens to long-term employment and making collective action or dissent economically dangerous. This debt creates a constant systemic demand for inflation, because inflation erodes the real value of the loan over time, making repayment psychologically bearable. And this debt reinforces the political system that guarantees its repayment. Voters rarely challenge the system when their house, their car, and their children's education are collateralized by it. The architecture ensures that the individual must perpetually work to service the debt, channeling labor and future earnings back into the corporate and sovereign layers. The self-sustaining cycle. This is the great, terrifying insight. The mysterious creditor is not external. It is the feedback loop between these three layers. Governments borrow to create stability, trust. Corporations leverage that stability to create growth, profit. Individuals borrow against that profit to maintain consumption, compliance. The entire structure is a closed circuit where money constantly flows from the bottom, labor, to the top, centralized asset pools, with the promise of interest payments keeping the system moving. The only way the cycle continues is through infinite exponential expansion. And that brings us to the ultimate, final question that this architecture cannot answer. If the entire system is designed to grow forever, what happens when it hits a limit it cannot borrow its way past? A limit of resources, a limit of trust, a limit of energy. The hidden architecture of financial power is the most incredible machine humanity has ever built. But it is a machine with a single, fatal flaw. It is fundamentally unsustainable because it demands more from reality than reality can deliver. The final creditor, as we discussed, is time. And time is the one entity in the universe that accepts no bonds, grants no loans, and demands its payment in full. The moment the system slows, the architecture doesn't just wobble. It begins to disassemble itself. The layers turn on each other. And the mysterious creditor, the self-feeding machine, finally starves. You have journeyed with us through the hidden architecture of global debt, through the illusions of value, the psychology of borrowing, and the self-sustaining cycle that binds every country, every corporation, and every individual on Earth. You now understand that the $300 trillion debt is not owed to a mysterious king or a shadowy cabal. It is owed to the system itself, a machine built on the fundamental belief in infinite tomorrow. And that machine's greatest creditor is time. The final question is no longer financial, but philosophical. Can we, as a species, find the courage to challenge a system that demands endless growth? Or will we remain enslaved by the comfort of our own collective debt? This is the central tension of the 21st century. If this deep, unsettling insight into the real nature of global power resonated with you, if this story changed the way you look at money, banking, and the price of a loaf of bread, then do not let this knowledge remain silent. We need your engagement to ensure this critical analysis reaches the maximum number of people. Hit the like button right now. Every like is a vote for truth and a signal that this complex, hidden reality needs to be exposed. Leave a comment below and tell us, if you could eliminate one layer of the debt architecture, the sovereign, the corporate, or the individual layer, which would it be, and why? Let us know your thoughts below. Subscribe, and ring the notification bell, because the global debt clock never stops ticking, and we will be here every week to track the consequences, expose the power shifts, and prepare you for the great reckoning when it finally arrives. Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next breakdown.